Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. So, a bit of introduction about myself. So, I'm Edward Lowis. I'm currently the VP of Research at Sucor Sekuritas. So, we are one of the leading private full-service brokerage firm here in Indonesia. And today, I'm very happy, and we are very fortunate to have with us Raditya Wibowo. He's the co-founder and CEO of MAKA Motors. So MAKA Motors have a booth downstairs. So I strongly encourage you to go and have a visit to see the mock-up of the vehicle. So Dit, great to see you here again. So maybe can you kick things off by telling us a bit about yourself and what has been happening at MAKA Motors?
Thanks, Edward.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here today. Thank you, East Ventures, for arranging the event, obviously. The logistics must be quite complicated, but it seems like it's being managed very well. So this is our third year as a company. We started in 2021. My name is Dito. I'm the founder and CEO. Before MAKA, I was at Gojek, running Gojek's transportation business. So I know a bit about motorcycles. I've been a motorcycle user myself since high school as well. In fact, I rode a motorcycle here today. It's the same one I've been using since high school, so it's a 20-year-old bike. That's what we're up against. Why am I not riding my own bike? Simply because we're still preserving confidentiality. So the bike is done. Definitely would love to show you at the factory. You can try it. Today we have a VR version that you can see downstairs. Which should give you a good idea. But so Wilson asked us to bring the bike, but we don't want people to take photos and for it to go everywhere until we do our actual launch, which will be very soon. So Q4 this year, we are going to be launching our first product to market. As I mentioned, it's been 3 years. We're definitely not the first to market, but we think we have the best product. And I'd be very excited to talk a bit more about why we think that is.
Sure. Thank you, Dit, for the great introduction. So we have a lot of topics to discuss today. So let us jump right into our discussion. So we know that the two-wheel EV market in Indonesia has really taken off, right? Sales has been increasing by over 260% last year. But apparently, we only have about 59,000 of electric motorbikes.
Right.
That are actually on the road today, out of 120 million motorbikes.
Yes.
And even though we have, I think, close to 60 models available
Yes.
On the market today. So the question is, what do you think is holding back this adoption? And how do you plan to ramp up adoption in such a crowded and competitive market?
Right. So I think definitely, if you look at the growth numbers, they look high, but that's because it's starting from a small base, right? And if you look at the penetration against the total amount of two-wheelers sold, it is definitely still very low, right? So by our estimates, it's somewhere between 0.6, 0.8% last year. Whereas if you look at four-wheelers, that number is actually a lot higher. So in Q1 this year alone, that number was between 3 to 4%. I think recently a very large brand launched from China, BYD. Since then, I think that number has gone up even higher. So penetration on four-wheelers is happening faster than two-wheelers, which is kind of surprising because I think everyone was expecting that it would happen the other way around because two-wheelers are actually cheaper, right? So the question is why, right? As you mentioned, it is not because of lack of choice. There's a lot of products you can buy today with a government subsidy. There are more than 20 brands. There's all kinds of different form factors you can buy, all kinds of different price points as well. So it's also not an affordability issue because you have products ranging from below 10 million rupiah. And by the way, the cheapest ICE model you can buy today, a new model, is 18 million rupiah, right? So you have EVs that are much more affordable than that. You also have EVs that are a bit more expensive, but you get a bigger battery, you get more power. But yet the sales, the traction is still not kind of what everyone expected, right? Again, especially compared to cars. So our view is that the market is definitely waiting for this inflection point, right? The question is, what will trigger it? And I think on cars, this has started happening already, right? And this is because the products you can buy on cars, they're all pretty good, right? So I think even the smallest one has more than 200 kilometers of range. So you're not worried about running out of battery on the road. You have a lot of legitimate brands. People trust in the quality, right? I think for two-wheelers, we're still very early in that sense, right? And this is kind of a problem because in Indonesia, for the two-wheeler users, the bike is their most expensive asset typically, right? So they will not own their house, but they will try to own their bike. In fact, they care so much about their bike that they park it inside their living room, so no one actually will steal it, right? So the bar is actually much higher for them to want to change their bike, right? And right now, what we see is that the products in the market today, they do not yet fulfill that standard. And we can talk a bit more about where we think the gaps are. But fundamentally, the answer to the question of why is the penetration not higher already, in my view, is because of the product. Because there are other issues with EVs that people always mention, right? For example, what about the resale value? What about the charging infrastructure? But these are also problems with four-wheelers, and you already see much higher penetration on four-wheelers.
Okay. And so what do you think is the inflection point? You mentioned a few points, but what do you think of the inflection points that will really catalyze the adoption? And do you still think that even at the current price of the EV vehicles, they are actually on the market, do you still think that it makes sense for consumer to switch to EV?
Right. So I think to answer that question, you first have to ask why would the consumer even switch to EV in the first place, right? Because the answer to that would not be saving the planet or reducing carbon emissions, right? Unfortunately, the consumers do not really care yet, right? If you look at, for example, Europe, some of my friends who have switched to EV, when I ask them why they switch, they say it's because it feels like they're doing the right thing, right? You will not find that for two-wheeler users here, at least not yet, right? The reason to switch to EV is to save money, right? And 100 kilometers on a gasoline bike is maybe 25 to 30,000 rupiah, right? On electricity, it's like 6,000 rupiah or less. So the savings are real. The delta is also significant. I think one thing that we've seen correlates highly to EV adoption in other markets is actually the price of petrol, right? So I think if you look at India, for example, two-wheeler EV penetration in India is a lot higher than it is today. One of the factors is because the delta between the electricity price and the fuel price is actually a bit bigger than what you see in Indonesia, right? So over time, though, I think the price of gasoline will probably not go down, right? Of course, it takes a while to bring it up because it's always a pretty tricky political issue. But I think that trend of gasoline prices going up is definitely something that will be a tailwind, we think, right? There have already been news about the government potentially limiting subsidized fuel only for bikes that have a smaller engine, right? So I think we'll see, because it's actually really hard to enforce these kinds of things on two-wheeler users in Indonesia. But that's definitely something that would help macro-wise. In terms of policy, we already have the 7 million rupiah subsidy for two-wheeler EVs with at least 40% local content. So that definitely helps, right? So if you look at the number of two-wheeler EVs sold last year, it was already at least 2x higher than the year before. And I think the government expected to be 2x higher as well this year. The problem is the base is very small, right? So we're still not unlocking that hockey stick trajectory, right? So I think government support is one. But ultimately, I think the real inflection point will be when the right product hits the market, right? Because if you think of the Indonesian consumer's purchase journey for a two-wheeler, right? It's actually quite simple. Because so first of all, they would be interested to switch to EV maybe to save money, but they might also just want to have a new bike, right? And the thought process for buying a new bike is always, so number one, they look at the bike, they decide whether they like the shape, right? So it always starts from the eye, right? So first, do they like how it looks? Second, they'll try it out. Do they like how it feels? Do they like how it handles? Do they like how it drives? And then they'll ask, how much is the monthly installment? And where is the after-sales center? Right? Because 70% of motorcycle purchases in Indonesia use financing, actually. So, and that also means, and this is something that sometimes people find quite surprising, the top 10, 15% of the market, the price point is above $2,000, $2,000, $2,100, which sounds very expensive, considering that the minimum wage today is like $300 or so. But people still are willing to spend on these bikes, right? Because it's kind of it's also a status symbol, right? They might not buy their house, but they want to have a nice bike. They see it as an asset. It's a depreciating asset. But to them, the choice is between either I spend my money and I have a bike that holds value, or I don't buy a bike and I don't know what happens to my money, right? So the moment you have a product that ticks all those boxes is, I think, when the inflection point will start. Now, we're hoping that we become one of the first, right? But again, we have kind of chosen to go the difficult route, right? By doing our own R&D, right? For an established automotive company, it takes 3 years to launch a new model. We're working on a slightly faster timeline, but starting from scratch. Yeah, but we're getting really close. So we're very excited to bring our product to market this year. And as Edward mentioned, definitely do feel free to check out the VR version downstairs. It should give you a good sense of how the bike looks and feels.
Okay. And let's move on to the next topic.
Sure.
This is regarding the competitive landscape here.
Yes.
So as mentioned, there are a lot of players for two-wheel EV market here in Indonesia.
Right.
They are from the domestic players, like I mentioned a few names like Alpha, Electrum, and also recently we have seen an influx of foreign players entering the market, like the
Yes.
Chinese and of course the incumbent Japanese manufacturers. So the question is, what specific strategies that you will employ to differentiate yourself and compete effectively against these more established players?
Right, right. So I think if you look at who the competition is, right, in my view, the whole EV market is still so small, right, that the way I see it is we should actually be friends among all the EV players, because we need to kind of stick together, right? If some problem happens to one brand, it affects the whole sector at this point, right? Because it might make people lose trust in EVs in general. Our real competition is the incumbent, which is gasoline, right? And if you look at the gasoline market for two-wheelers, it's very much dominated by actually one player, right? The top two players are both Japanese brands, and they together collectively control 80 to 90% market share, right? So it's very much dominated. Now, do they have EV products? They do, right? Actually, the market leader, they launched their EV product last year. The price point is above 40 million rupiah, but the range is about like 40 kilometers, which we don't think is enough, right? So I think when you look at the incumbents, I think what we're seeing is that they don't really have an incentive to move first because they are basically only disrupting themselves, right? So if they are too aggressive on EVs, they basically eat up their own market share. And their business model, they also make a lot of margin from after sales, right? Which is a bit different for EVs, because EVs, you don't have plumas, what is that? You don't have lubricants that you need to replace every once in a while. You probably just need to replace the brake pads, right? So it's a bit of a different world. Also, they've invested so much in building a supply chain for making a lot of ICE components that you will not use again in EV, right? Also, even though they're very big brands, they don't really use batteries or electric motors or control units at large scale. So they will have more bargaining power, but it's not like they can get these components for magnitudes, for an order of magnitude cheaper than what a new player can get it for, right? So we think that right now, the dynamics there actually favor new players to make the first move. Of course, the challenge will be defending our lead once we get it, right? Now, in the EV sector itself, a lot of players are doing a lot of different things. Mostly out of the 57 models you see in the market today, these are mostly imported white label products from mostly China, right? Because China is the world's biggest two-wheeler EV market. It is actually, if you just want to bring a bike to Indonesia, you can go to China. There's so many suppliers. They will give you a catalog, so many different shapes. They've actually also been making the shapes more similar to the gasoline models that are popular here, right? So you can choose one, they'll give you a price, and then you can simply assemble it here, right? So that's what most companies are doing right now. Some companies, they've also realized that, but the problem with that is that the way the user uses the product in China is very different from Indonesia, right? Because in China, two-wheelers have their own lane, right? So you're not fighting with cars. You don't need to overtake cars. You are also most of the time riding solo, and there's a maximum top speed of 45 kilometers per hour. So here, half of the time you have a passenger on board, and you need enough power to overtake cars and like kind of slip in between cars. It's not just power, it's actually control, right? You need the bike to respond predictably. Because very often you are stuck in a traffic jam going uphill on a very narrow road. And if your bike slides backwards, you will hit another bike, right? So it's not just power, it's also control. And in terms of range, in China, 40 kilometers total travel distance a day is already very long. Because these are it's more of a first mile, last mile use case. You're traveling shorter distances to and from the train station. In Indonesia, average travel distance in Jakarta, for example, is like 30 to 40 kilometers, but the edge case is 100 kilometers or more, right? So people do travel long distances every day. They are worried about running out of battery. So if you take a bike with specs based on the Chinese user and bring it here, it's kind of hard to make it work, right? And I think that's what we've seen the last 3 years. This is why the adoption has been a bit slower. Now, some other brands, they've realized this, and they have developed new products as well, with better specs, bigger battery, bigger motor, but they do not do the R&D in-house, so they work with a partner, right? And I think this is a step in the right direction, but what you end up seeing is because the R&D is typically done by outside Indonesia, there are a lot of details and specs with the bike that are just a bit off, right? For example, the ergonomics, so leg position. Sometimes, even with the more expensive bikes, your leg is very high like this, and then when you turn, it kind of hits your leg. Yeah, I don't know why they make it that way, but this is something that's very common with a lot of existing platforms that are used from China, right? And then things like when you pull on the throttle, the bike kind of jumps, right? And I think, again, if you just see the bike as a tool, maybe you think people shouldn't care as much, but to my earlier point, for the two-wheeler user, this is a very big deal because this is the most expensive thing they own, so it has to be perfect, right? And I think that's the bar that we need to meet. And because we're not the first to market, we have to make sure our product is 100% high quality so that we can actually make that inflection point happen.
Great. So now I know some of the characteristic of the vehicle that you are working on. So really it caters to the needs and specific requirement of the local Indonesian consumer. So for the next question, this is regarding also the target market. So can you specify which consumer market that MAKA Motor is targeting? And how does your product design and marketing strategy cater to the needs and preference of the segment?
Right. So again, I think this is an interesting point because I will again contrast four-wheelers and two-wheelers, right? If you look at four-wheeler EVs, the customers that buy them are mostly retail, actually. They're using it for personal use. In fact, I know at least 2 people in this room who have a four-wheeler EV, right? Retail consumers. But if you look at two-wheelers, it is actually mostly on-demand drivers today, right? There's very few retail consumers who have actually decided to switch their bikes to EV. And these on-demand drivers, they are typically doing a daily rental scheme for these bikes. Yeah, so they're renting the bike every day. It's less commitment for them than taking out a normal 2 to 3 year installment. And whenever they decide they don't want to continue, they can just kind of opt out, right? So that's kind of the situation today. So if you look at two-wheeler EVs on the road, most of the time it will be a ride-hailing driver using it, and they are using it on a daily rental basis, right? And the reason they do that is because they still save money compared to gasoline, right? any EV will be cheaper than a fuel bike, right? But in a way, sometimes they kind of put up with these bikes simply because they want to save money. That's why they're not actually buying them in the normal way, which is to take out a 2 to 3 year installment, right? Now, in terms of who we're targeting, obviously ride-hailing drivers are an important segment, right? They are a very large percentage of active users on the road. They're very highly visible. But there's actually probably only about 3 to 4 million ride-hailing drivers in general in Indonesia. And as you mentioned, the installed base of motorcycles is 130 million-ish, right? And every year there's 6 million new bikes sold. So even though the ride-hailing drivers are a large percentage of active users on the road, they are a small percentage of the total user base. And the challenge to unlock that inflection point in EV demand, you need to be able to crack retail, right? And in my view, this is what no one else has been able to do so far, right? Again, because we think it's a product issue. So because for the retail consumer, the bar is a bit higher, right? They're just not they're not just looking to save money. They also want a cool bike, right? And they want a bike that they can be proud of. Yes. So our main target segment is retail, right? In fact, when you think of ride-hailing drivers, it's still retail because ultimately the driver makes their own decision on what bike they want to buy, right? We have a strategic MOU with Gojek, obviously, right? So we will sell to drivers together. We will have favorable packages and everything, but at the end of the day, no one can force the drivers to buy a specific bike. That all comes back to the driver and to the bike. So our focus is on making sure we have the best bike at the best price point.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next topic, this is regarding the affordability and also the financing options.
Yes.
So, as we mentioned, price is usually a significant factor for
Right.
consumer. And how do you plan to make your EV more affordable to the average consumer? And is there any financing options or partnership that you have with financial institution to facilitate the easier purchase system for the consumer?
Right. So having a strong financing offer is definitely a must-have when we launch, right? As I mentioned, 70% of motorcycle purchases in Indonesia use financing. The good thing is there's a lot of options, right? So many multi-finance companies have started doing EV financing. Of course, sometimes their concern is also on resale value, right? So that's definitely something that we have to sort out. But we will definitely have a financing partner at launch. We're actively talking to a few already. In terms of making the bike affordable, I think the government subsidy definitely helps, right? But when we first started this company, there was no subsidy. So definitely we want to make sure that the business plan still works, even if the subsidy is not there, right? That's why our price point, again, so there are 3 price points in the two-wheeler market in Indonesia, roughly, yeah. The lowest price point, the entry-level price point is 18 million rupiah, which, by the way, is already pretty high. If the last time you bought a bike was like, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, the bikes were still like, I don't know, 11, 12 million. Yeah, so the price keeps going up, right? So 18 million is the cheapest. And then you have the middle segment, which ranges from 23 to 27 million. Yeah, so this is like 20-30% of the market, right? The cheapest price point is 50 to 60%. And then your top 10 to 15%, that's what we call the maxi scooter segment, right? So this is about 32 million rupiah and above. 32 to 36, actually. In fact, the top end was very high, right? So you have bikes that cost like 60 million as well. But the moment you go above 36 million, it becomes quite niche, right? Because 36 million is the price of the most expensive ICE model that still sells at scale. The moment you go above that, it's very hard to scale. So our price point is basically in that segment, right? In the maxi scooter segment, the top 10%. But with the subsidy, we end up in the middle segment, actually, right? So you get a maxi quality bike, but for the price of a mid-tier bike, and you save money on fuel, right? So I think one thing that the EV industry the two-wheeler EV industry needs to talk about a bit more is actually the savings. Because I think a lot of the marketing so far has been focused on carbon emissions, saving the planet, but what the customer cares about, as I mentioned, is saving money, right? So we need to emphasize that a bit more. Because Basically, switching to an EV, especially with the subsidy, if you compare it to buying a new bike, it kind of pays for itself by the second or third year, right? Again, depending on whether you do financing, what kind of interest rates you get. But the payback period is actually relatively quick.
Okay. Now, you mentioned briefly about the resale value of the vehicle,
Yes.
right? Which is also apparently a huge consideration for consumer.
Yes.
So, what strategy do you have to ensure the vehicle retain a reasonable value over time?
Right. So I think what the resale values will look like after 5 or 10 years, to be honest, there's no way to know, right? We do have benchmarks from other markets. We do see that in India, for example, the resale values for two-wheeler EVs are actually not as bad as we expected, right? Because I think initially we were thinking maybe it goes down like 50% or so, but I think what we've seen from the data we have is it's actually a bit higher than that, right? But in Indonesia specifically, the context might be different, right? So that's something we need to see. Now, what we can control is the warranty policy we give, right? And we think this is the most important thing to convince the customer because everyone is worried about the battery because they know the battery is half the price of the bike, and if the battery breaks, then and they have to buy a new battery. It's sort of like buying a new bike. Also, your total cost of ownership calculations all get screwed up, right? If the battery breaks. So for us, having a robust battery is very, very important. And being able to offer a good warranty on that is important as well. Now, what we do, obviously, we developed our battery pack in-house, right? Together with our supplier, but the IP is ours. We have applied automotive standard engineering to everything inside the pack, including the waterproofing, the way we do the safety features for the pack, everything. So we think because we did that, we're comfortable with giving a good warranty, right? We will announce the exact warranty when we launch, but definitely. So if you look at how to measure the life cycle of a battery pack, it's measured in cycles, right? So one charging cycle is from empty to full to empty again. If your battery pack is small, you will quickly run out of cycles, but our battery pack is pretty big. So we're confident this battery pack can go hundreds of thousands of kilometers until it runs out of cycles. And I think we hope that that's definitely significant to convince the customer because the average user goes 10 to 20,000 kilometers a year, right? Even 20,000 is a lot. 10,000 is maybe average. So the battery does last a pretty long time, and we hope that ultimately also helps with resale value.
All right. Thank you, Dit, for sharing your insight and answering my questions. So now I'd like to open the floor for questions. I think we have time for maybe one questions. So if anyone has any questions, so please raise your hands and feel free to ask. Well, I think we covered pretty much every topics that we can think of. In the interest of time, I think let's conclude this session. Right. So again, thank you again, Radit. I wish you and MAKA Motor a great success.
Thank you.